Senator Ron Wyden, so good to see you again.
Oh, thanks for having me,
It's been all of 12 hours.
At least, yeah, since Lions for Life.
Yesterday, I saw you both at Lions for Life and the ACLU event, and you're doing all these amazing town halls around Oregon. How many town halls have you attended?
We've done 11 in the last 8 days, and what's striking, we've done them in urban areas where there's probably more concern about the president's policies than a lot of other places. We've done them in counties that Donald Trump won by 20 percentage points, like Coos and Curry. And what's striking is the concerns, while there are areas of difference, are remarkably similar.
What are the biggest concerns you're hearing?
The Affordable Care Act is right up at the top of the list. I mean, people understand, for example, that the president promised to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, and we're hearing a lot about repeal, but we're not hearing too much about replace. And you look, for example, at the new head of Health and Human Services, Congressman Tom Price, and he's introduced legislation in the past that would create a lot of loopholes, for example, to the protection for folks who are faced with pre-existing conditions. So my read is that Oregonians are really following the issues. The Affordable Care Act is obviously a very important one. They're concerned about a free press and independent judiciary. They're concerned about Russia. They're concerned about environmental policies. So there's a lot people are following.
I want to zero in on Russia, if we could. You are one of the ranking members on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and I know as of Friday, the FBI Director James Comey met with you to talk. What did he say? What can you tell us about what came out of that meeting? Well,
you can't get into any deliberations,
right?
And suffice it to say, there is a new development here just in the last couple of days. Questions with respect to the impartiality of the Intelligence Committee leadership. There's supposed to be a firewall between the FBI and the Intelligence Committee leadership during an investigation like this, and there have been some reports, news reports about how at the behest of the White House, they were speaking out on the inquiry, and if this is true, this would be a very troubling development in the inquiry.
It's been reported that Reince Priebus privately reached out to the FBI twice to try to shut these investigations down. The first time, he asked Andrew McCabe to publicly announce the phone calls between Trump's advisors in Russia never took place. The second time, he wanted you to deny completely. What mechanism does the Senate Intelligence Committee have if indeed this took place?
Well, first of all, as I indicated, this raises questions that, if correct, are going to cause people to doubt the impartiality of the inquiry. And as I said today at the town hall meeting, that if this is true, I'm going to sign on as a co-sponsor of the bill to create an independent commission. Now, my hope has been, and we've had very extensive discussions, that the Intelligence Committee will be able to do an independent inquiry. I've insisted on open hearings. I've insisted on declassification. I've insisted on subpoena power. But the new development that you have just cited is certainly very troubling, and we're going to have to get to the bottom of it at the beginning of the week.
This week was the first time that I heard a Republican senator actually asking for a special prosecutor, Darrell Issa. In his asking for a prosecutor, do you begin to see a softening on the part of some Republicans to say, yes, we actually do need to look into this further?
Well, Darrell Issa, the congressman from California, certainly has, I think, made a very clear impression with respect to his call. In the Senate, John McCain and Lindsey Graham have been particularly prominent in saying that this matter with respect to Russia interfering in the integrity of our elections is something that needs to be followed up on. And Lindsey Graham, to his credit, a couple of days ago, conservative South Carolina Republican, said that an independent judiciary and a free press were worth fighting for.
We hear these names time and time again, though, and I don't see a big coalition of Republicans that are deeply concerned about this. And when I look at the makeup of the Intelligence Committee, it's 9 Republicans and 5 Democrats. Is this going to be an impartial thing, or is this going to go down party lines?
The press release that was put out by the chairman, Richard Burr, And the vice chairman, Democrat Senator Mark Warner, talked about some of the areas that I insisted on, which were open hearings, the ability to have subpoena power, the opportunity for declassification. And look, it's pretty obvious if these reports that have been coming out here in the last day or so that you have cited are accurate, that raises very troubling questions about whether the committee can do an impartial inquiry. So I can tell you we're going to get to the bottom of it, and
I guess
we'll have to see.
Senator, what I want to understand, especially for our listeners and for people watching right now on Facebook, is how much independence do you have? If it becomes a Republican-Democrat thing, can the Democrats just go ahead and forge on with their own investigation?
First of all, it can't be allowed to do this because these are issues that go to the legitimacy of government. That affects Democrats, Republicans, liberals, and conservatives. Now, John McCain and Lindsey Graham, to their credit, they are conservative Republicans, have been outspoken about this. There have been other Senate Republicans, Marco Rubio, Roy Blunt, that have raised important questions. Now, suffice it to say, a lot of those senators and Congress members are home in their states right now, and I think they're probably, based on everything that I've seen, getting a real earful, and that the American people want to get to the bottom of this.
Given the scope of the current hearings, do you expect that we will see Michael Flynn be called to testify under oath?
I think that is absolutely essential. And clearly, unless Michael Flynn walks in to the Intelligence Committee in an open intelligence hearing and raises his right hand and takes the oath and tells the country what in the heck is going on here, a lot of people are going to doubt whether this is a credible inquiry. So that's particularly important to me.
When you look back in history, you've been a member of the Intelligence Committee 17 years. Am I correct?
I'm along with Senator Feinstein, the longest serving member of the Intelligence Committee in history.
Is there anything in your history that's been similar to this? Anything you can look at that will say, I'm using my experience to call on what I'm going to bring to this particular investigation?
Well, let's put it in a historical context. For decades now, a Democratic president or a Republican president, if faced with what Vladimir Putin has done in terms of the Ukraine and Crimea and the poisoning of journalists and the human rights violations, they would have been all in terms of sanctions, and other approaches would have made it clear that kind of conduct is unacceptable. Donald Trump has had nothing to say, as far as I can tell, that's critical about Vladimir Putin. Now, when you couple that with the news reports about the family's longtime and extensive financial connections with the Russians, and the fact that he hasn't released his tax returns, that's a pretty troubling combination of factors.
You are alluding to what Hillary Clinton said when she called the president a puppet. In the debate, she called Donald Trump a puppet of Russia. Do you believe he's a puppet of Russia?
I believe in looking at the hard evidence. A, he's had nothing critical to say about Vladimir Putin, even though every past president in the last 30, 40 years certainly would have. B, he's the only president in 40 years to not disclose his tax returns. Every Democrat, every Republican since Watergate has done that. And C, particularly because he has these views that are so different than our previous presidents, and there have been many news reports about articles relating to his family's involvement with the Russians over the years, it raises a very serious question of whether or not his allegiances are to the American people or to his financial investments.
Reuters has reported that the FBI is now pursuing 3 separate probes related to Russia's dealing with the presidential elections, which includes but not limited to the financial transactions by Russian operatives and the communication that his staff had with them during the elections. Give us a sense of which of those things is likely to bear fruit in your mind.
I can't get into that.
Can you talk about the different investigations? Can you confirm the investigations are going on?
I cannot. It touches on committee deliberations, and that's just something you can't get into. What I can say is what was released yesterday, that there are real questions about whether the traditional firewall between the White House and the FBI was observed. That's something I'm following very closely and digging into.
I have had so many people ask me, will there be any guarantee to the American people that there's going to be a thorough investigation into Donald Trump, into Russia, into Michael Flynn? And because the dealings are secret, I don't think there's anyone who can absolutely say yes. Can you give the people who are listening today any assurity that we have any kind of government backup that is working on behalf of the American people to get to this?
Sheila, what I can say and what I've said at the 11 town hall meetings, this is so important. I am not going to let it get swept under the rug. Now, if you'll recall, because I think you all covered it, we had a real challenge several years ago because so many prominent intelligence officials were saying one thing in public and saying another thing in private. So I spent many months preparing to ask at a public hearing, James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, whether the government collected any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans. He lied. That changed the debate and was a very significant factor in terms of what eventually happened in terms of the information coming out and the passage of the USA Freedom Act to curtail the collection of a lot of that phone record information on innocent Americans. So I think there's pretty clear track record that I'm persistent on these matters.
You were known previously, and I've known you for all of the time that you've served, you were known previously as being more of a moderate, a person who would work across the aisle, a person who was seen as for some liberals anyway, as perhaps being too willing to actually compromise. On these issues, you're the most outspoken voice. Why?
Well, first of all, I want it understood that I still look for common ground in every area possible. For example, I've been talking at the town hall meetings about the Affordable Care Act. I'm the ranking Democrat on the Finance Committee, which has jurisdiction over health and taxes. And I've said if the Republicans are willing to drop the partisan approach, I'm very willing, and I think Democrats would be, to work to strengthen the Affordable Care Act to deal with one of the significant problems, which is the individual insurance market. So my preference is still to try to find common ground wherever possible. Now, these issues that we're talking about with respect to intelligence policy and technology, I don't think fit neatly into Democratic and Republican, boxes. I think, for example, that Americans want security and liberty, and increasingly they're getting policies that give them less of both. And I think you see that with the efforts to weaken strong encryption and require companies to build backdoors into their products.
Much of the information that we have, or at least that the public has, that they know about some of the allegations that Donald Trump is in terms of his financial dealings and how Russia gained the information, was brought about by a dossier that was released, and the Trump administration will say it was released illegally. I have read recently that intelligence officials are now able to actually back up some of the details within that dossier. Can you use a document that was brought to you by Hillary Clinton's campaign? Does it even help you in any stretch of the imagination? Is that even something you're going to take a look at?
First of all, let's review what happened earlier in the day, because that's a matter of public record. We had an open hearing in the Intelligence Committee. And as I just indicated in terms of my questioning of James Clapper, I spent a lot of time getting ready for those public hearings. James Comey was there that afternoon, and I said, I'm going to read you from press reports. And they talked about contacts between the Russian foreign minister and the Trump campaign. I said, have you all followed up on these matters? And if so, what do you want to tell the American people? And he said, oh, my goodness, I can't talk about investigations. And a lot of people, of course, recalled that 11 days before the election, he had plenty to say about open investigations. And I think that was a major factor in our working out the agreement for a bipartisan investigation into these matters.
This was happening before Americans went to the polls. We've recently just seen so many leaks from the intelligence community. We kind of know about the background, or at least we know loosely about what's happening with these investigations. Why weren't there leaks about Russia's meddling in our elections? Why weren't they at least interested in letting the electorate know that the Russians were attempting to try to elect Donald Trump?
The intelligence leadership did. I mean, the fact is, early in October, James Clapper, then the Director of National Intelligence, and Jay Johnson, then the Director of Homeland Security, put out a joint statement saying that it was their view, and these are the top officials in the intelligence community, it was their view that the Russians had been meddling in our elections. So it came out in October. Then, of course, after the election, I led an effort with 7 senators to try to get more information declassified, because I thought then and continue to think now there could be more information declassified that wouldn't compromise what are called sources and methods. And then I followed up by asking James Comey some questions in an open session.
Given the Trump administration's vitriol toward the press right now, given how many restrictions there are on even access to the press, how are we actually going to have a free and open press get to the bottom of what's happening right now?
I was very appreciative when Lindsey Graham, the conservative Republican senator from South Carolina, said that an independent judiciary and a free press were worth fighting for. And the reality is, the reason the American people know today about Michael Flynn is because of the press. So journalists like yourself are, I think, especially important. My dad was a reporter and a journalist. He wrote historical nonfiction. My favorite book of his is The Bay of Pigs, about the Bay of Pigs, the untold story about what happened in Cuba during the Castro regime. And Castro is on the back of the book in a picture with my father saying Peter Wyden knows more about what happened than we do. So I'm a strong supporter of the press. And by the way, I'm the co-chair of the Whistleblowers Caucus, and I suspect we're going to be pretty busy here in the days ahead.
President Trump just banned 2 major organizations from the press room. There's no precedent for that. Where do you go from here? If the president says, I only want Breitbart News and bloggers who will blog for the right, or talk radio hosts who appear conservative enough to get in the room?
Americans can vote with their eyeballs and vote with their own judgments. I think for him to just, in effect, say that he is going to blockade certain sources because he thinks they don't agree with him, Americans have a right to, because Donald Trump is a creature of the media. Nobody got more free minutes of airtime than Donald Trump. He got more free minutes of airtime, as far as I can tell, than everybody else put together. So Americans can make judgments about the news sources that they want. I personally try to always follow a cross-section of news sources, because I think that ensures that I'm really in an objective position to think through how debates are going to go.
Senator Wyden, I know many people who are watching are frightened. They're really concerned about the rapid nature of how the Trump administration is changing the America they came to know. They want to know what they can really do to help. What are your thoughts?
Here's what I tell people. First, I think when 3,500 people come to a town meeting, as they did today, and this was not the only one. In Sisters, I had 800 people in a community of something like 2,000 people. So I saw this all over the state through the 11 meetings. So coming to town meetings is helpful. Marching is helpful. The Women's March was a fabulous thing. Nancy and I were there to greet scores and scores of Oregonians, and that was important. My personal favorite, Sheila, is that if people see that on an issue that's particularly important to them, that senators from another state are going to be the deciding vote, I think it is really helpful if someone from Oregon calls, if they have a friend in one of those other states, somebody maybe who was in their wedding or they were a college roommate with, and calls up and says, we've never gotten into this kind of thing. I don't call you up for some political thing on a regular basis, but this issue is so important. And I think because of our shared values, it would be great if you would call up your senator. I think those are the kinds of things that really help.
I want to just ask one final question about Russia, and then we're going to need to wrap it up. Let's say that you find out the president did know that he was actually the person who instructed Michael Flynn to have these conversations with Russia, that he actually agreed that we're going to lift some sanctions if indeed they supported him during this election. Let's play it out that perhaps you even find financial ties in Russia. All the way through you find it. What happens to President Trump?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to speculate about something that is.
Let's just talk process.
Well, yeah. Look, there are a variety of questions that come up. I was asked today at the town hall meeting about impeachment. That is something that comes up in the House of Representatives. There are a whole host of issues, and I'm not going to speculate. What I'm going to tell people and tell your listeners is I'm going to do my job. My job as the ranking Democrat on the Finance Committee, I manage the Tom Price nomination, Congressman Tom Price. I'm very troubled about his approach on Medicare to privatize the program. What I'm trying to do is update the Medicare guarantee to have it start focusing on cancer and diabetes and heart disease, because chronic illness is going to be 80% or more of the Medicare program. So I have a lot of tools at my disposal as a United States Senator. The reason we had a 6-hour debate on Mike Pompeo is that Mitch McConnell was trying to move that nomination on Inauguration Night when a lot of Republicans were trying to see if their tux fit. And I said, no way, I'm not going to give consent to it.
The reason that I ask is because with majorities in both houses to Republicans, can you really expect that you're going to have an impeachment vote that will actually yield any kind of results?
Well, by the way, I'm not speculating on any impeachment. I'm just describing so that people know, because I was asked the question today, what about it? And I said, it originates in the House of Representatives. Now, let me tell you the issue I think is the one to watch, in addition to Russia, and that's the Affordable Care Act.
Okay.
Because the president promised that there would be a repeal and replace. And they're going pretty heavy on repeal, but not much on replace. And I think as of today, the Republicans don't have a winning proposal to do repeal and replace. And I think the Affordable Care Act may be the issue that breaks the back of some of the extremism we're seeing from the far right.
Very interesting. I really do wish you could answer the question about what is the path forward if indeed we find out the president is a puppet of Russia.
And I'm just not going to speculate on something like that, because what I do when there's an investigation is you follow the facts. You go wherever the facts lead you, and it's not Democrats and Republicans in terms of facts, but I'll tell you what it's not. It's not alternative facts. We've heard a lot about that.
Senator Ron Wyden, thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.